Okay, so I'm really happy that Amita Baviskar has come all the way from India to be with us today and to present her work. So I'll just briefly present you. You're I have to check this. Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth in New Delhi. She has authored and edited various books. One of the most famous, which you might know, is In the Belly of the River, Tribal Conflicts over Development in the Narmada Valley. And since then, she has worked on various related themes, including resource rights, subaltern resistance, and cultural identity. Then she has also worked on urban environmental politics, especially bourgeois environmentalism, and spatial restructuring in the context of economic liberalization in Delhi. And her latest research has looked at changing food practices in Western India in relation to the transformation of agrarian environments. So we're very happy that you're here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Yeah. In early September in 2010, people who live in Delhi saw an unprecedented sight in the center of the city. Erased from view was the unremarkable green and brown plain dotted with fields, trees, and huts where the river Yamuna usually flows in a small and sluggish stream. Instead, there was a shimmering sheet of water which stretched out wide, blotting out the land and lapping at the bottom of the old iron railway bridge. And close to the bridge were the submerged homes of squatters. A few thousand residents had been evacuated and housed in tents where they stayed for the next 2 weeks until the river ebbed. For many of them, this kind of temporary displacement because of annual flooding was something that they were used to. It was an inevitable part of the experience of living by the river and trying to make a slender living from growing vegetables and melons on the seed belt. Now, the sudden rise of the river Yamuna was caused by heavy monsoons, the rains which fall in the months of May to August. And these monsoon rains had caused flooding in the catchment of the river in the lower foothills of the Himalayas. And although the annual monsoon rain always brings about a major rise in the level of the river, there was a sudden non-stop downpour in September 2010, which raised water levels to such a height that the protection that was given by the embankments and the dams suddenly seemed very shaky. So with the river now threatening to spill over its embankments and reclaim its floodplain, the upstream state of Haryana, upstream of Delhi, had been forced to release large quantities of water to make sure that its own barrages and embankments were safe. And it did so by breaching the embankment and flooding more than 120 villages above Delhi. And by doing this, of course, it ended up submerging a lot of farmland. But what it also did was to dissipate some of the violent energy of the river in spate, which then ended up helping the city of Delhi downstream, because that water then didn't affect the city as much. Delhi had experienced floods before. In 1978, the worst floods in living memory, 1 million people were affected as the river reached its highest recorded level. In comparison, these floods in 2010 were minor and short-lived. Streets in low-lying areas stayed waterlogged for about a week. People and vehicles had to wade through a foot or more of muddy water. And for 10 days, the sewage and stormwater drains flowing from the city to the river were shut in order to preempt a further rise in the river's level. And residents who lived in areas close to the river had to cope with smelly sewage backflow and toilets that wouldn't flush. But very soon, the river returned to its former shrunken state. Sewage once more flowed into it unabated, and the crisis of the floods had passed. Once more, the city had weathered another monsoon, another imminent flood, as it's likely to do again this year in the months of August and September. But what was unusual and in fact unprecedented about the 2010 floods was not the fact that they occurred, but their visibility to the city at large. Previous floods had come and gone, but only the people who were directly affected by them, usually a tiny minority in a city of 14 million people, were actually aware of them, as were the government agencies. But in the case of the 2010 floods, dozens of television news channels stationed their outdoor broadcasting vans to film the river, reporting minute by minute on the rising water, its proximity to the danger mark, the dislocation of traffic, the plight of displaced squatters, and interviewing government officials and residents in flood threatened neighborhoods. In September 2010, when the Yamuna in Delhi was flowing 2 meters above its danger mark of 204 meters, the river had finally become newsworthy. Now, the dramatized relaying of this event to the public eye was not only the result of the inherently spectacular character of the river in flood, it was also partly an offshoot of the growth of news media in search of new material to televise during its round the clock broadcasts. Since the onset of economic liberalization in India in the 1990s, which opened up television channels to private companies, the demand for reportage and features has risen. Disasters and crises help to fill the constant demand for news, and television, along with older forms of print capitalism, have helped produce not only floods as news, but they've also helped produce an urban public that is concerned by threats to parts of their city. Aiding the task of the news media in making the floods visible was a new and notable development on the right bank of the river, the Yamuna Expressway. Completed in the summer of 2010, the concrete pillars of this gigantic four-lane highway march parallel to the riverbed, offering a high vantage point from where you can observe the river that had so far been hidden from view. The broadcasting vans with their overhead satellite dishes and smartly dressed correspondents reporting live from location joined curious onlookers crowding the edge of the expressway, gazing out at the spreadsheet of water below them. Without the expressway, the eloquence of that liquid expanse of floods, the endangered iron bridge, the treetops sticking out like miniature bushes from the water would be invisible. Without the expressway, there would be nowhere to stand and nothing to see. Without the expressway, for most residents of Delhi, the river would cease to be. In the story of the Yamuna's shifting visibility in the social and ecological imagination of Delhi, the expressway is an irony. Built to ease road traffic congestion along the city's north-south artery, its construction was speeded up for the Commonwealth Games that were held in October 2010. The highway rides over the river's western embankment, cutting through an unfamiliar landscape. The riverbed to one side, and on the other the back view of a power station. There are no recognizable landmarks, no street side vendors or shops, no passing pedestrians, only a broad stretch of concrete, speeding cars, and big blue signboards announcing exits and destinations. The expressway, especially in the darkness of night, is a disorienting place. In fact, at first glance, it doesn't seem to be a place at all. Marc Auger used the term non-place to describe a space which cannot be defined as relational, historical, or concerned with identity. Highway routes, along with airports and hotel chains, are part of a fleeting, transient, and ephemeral world that people increasingly inhabit, spaces of circulation, consumption, and communication, where the link between individuals and their surroundings is established primarily through the mediation of words, even prescriptive instructions of use, for instance, signboards. Auger contrasts non-places with what he calls anthropological places that create organically social relations, locating them at the opposite end of the spectrum of sociality and socialization in terms of identity and history. Auger also points out that it's precisely their anonymity and streamlined ease of negotiation that makes non-places the site where desires and aspirations are increasingly located in a world surrendered to solitary individuality. This would certainly be true of projects like the Expressway, which concretely embody the desires shared by the Delhi government and many of its citizens to make the city world-class, visually aligned with a modernist Western aesthetic and physically re-engineered to make people move as swiftly as possible by minimizing the friction of having to engage with their surroundings. Richard Sennett calls this a neutralized city, where spaces are carefully orchestrated to remove the threat of social contact especially between different kinds of people. So the fact that the expressway brought into view the river, however fleetingly, for the citizens of Delhi was an irony. In the world-class city, the Yamuna is an anomaly, it's even an embarrassment. Next to the expressway to supermodernity, it's an especially awkward present. Urban eyes struggle to make sense of it. Is it nature or culture? Both these socially produced categories come with recognizable markers. If urban nature has come to be identified with manicured parks, the Yamuna is a wilderness of shifting sandbanks, grasses, and crops. Nor is it explicable in terms of rural nature. It's neither forest nor intensively cultivated farmland. For Delhi residents, then, the riverbed doesn't fit within popular notions of nature. Only when it is in spate does the river seem to assert its biophysical power. And even then, the network of barrages and embankments usually succeeds in domesticating the river, rendering it into a human made artifact, controlled and managed. The Yamuna in Delhi makes little cultural sense either. In a country where rivers are an intrinsic part of sacred geography, especially for the dominant Hindu majority, the Yamuna is curiously profane. The stepped ghats that lead down to the river along temples in a specific spot, Delhi's Jamuna Bazaar, are the site of Hindu funerary rites and other purificatory ceremonies. But the religious and cultural cosmos of the Yamuna is circumscribed to the Jamna Bazaar spot. Along the rest of a 22-kilometer long flow through the city, the river is neither revered nor regarded as important in the cultural life of citizens. It may be then said that for the citizens of Delhi, the river Yamuna is a non-place. If history, identity, and social relations are the hallmarks of an anthropological place, the Yamuna is perceived to be devoid of all these, except in the spot marked by Jamna Bazaar. In fact, the Yamuna is a non-place twice over, since it also lacks the aspirational qualities that Auger attributes to places of supermodernity. The non-place that is the expressway snakes past the non-place that is the river, their twinned flows signifying the contradiction that lies at the heart of Delhi. The expressway is a concrete manifestation of the city's futuristic vision, its world-class ambition brought into being, while the river is a watery nothingness. And yet the non-place that is the river in the city has accommodated small cultural worlds built around nature, microcosms that quietly continue around the year even as the rest of Delhi is unaware or indifferent of their presence. The stepped ghats at Jamna Bazaar descend to the river on broad flagstones, and the Yamuna licks at their feet, coaxing a red boat into the river. When the boat is midstream, a man flings a sweeping shower of grainy pellets around him. From nowhere come thousands of birds, circling and sweeping in ever-tightening circles, plucking the pellets from the water and soaring away. The air is dense with a flutter of white wings beating at the autumn light, a dizzy wheeling that goes on and on until the food disappears. The birds go to roost and the moment ebbs away. The birds are black-headed gulls. As he moors the boat, the man informs me that they come from Siberia. In the 4 months of winter, every morning and evening, he feeds them on behalf of his uncle, a well-to-do businessman. He says, 40 kilos in the morning, 60 kilos in the evening. 3,000 rupees a day it costs my uncle. Why does he do it? He says, they come from very far away, these birds. They are our guests. For the businessman, the birds from Siberia are visitors to whom hospitality is due, and the river provides a place for fulfilling the religious obligation to feed itinerants, as well as the charitable duty of caring for lesser creatures. For people from the walled city near Jamna Bazaar, the Yamuna offers a respite from urban congestion, from a life constantly crowded with people, sounds, and things. I asked Satyanarayan, a middle-aged man who told me that he worked in a hotel, why he came down to the ghats. He said, it's wide open and spacious here. One feels reassured. So for those searching for momentary peace, the river provides restful calm, a chance to catch one's breath and gather one's thoughts in an urban place where open space is usually scarce. In October, the islands and western margins of the riverbank are covered with sprawling fields of vegetables that supply inexpensive and fresh food to the city. The silt of the Yamuna is fertile. Cauliflowers and cabbages grow vigorously with beds of marigold and roses behind them. In the summer, there are cucumbers and melons. Lines of migrant workers bend and straighten, planting eggplants and chilies. Water gushes from a bore well. It's absolutely sweet, declares a farmer. The groundwater that's recharged by the Yamuna may be sweet, but studies indicate that the vegetables it irrigates are likely to be contaminated with fecal bacteria and heavy metals such as lead and cadmium. Untreated industrial effluents and domestic sewage that discharge into the river in Delhi and upstream mean that once the monsoon rain flow subsides, the river reverts to its undiluted state, still and stinking, foam-flecked and laden with the flotsam of the plastics packaging revolution. The water is black with filth. On the auspicious full moon day in October, I watch with awe as worshippers bathe in what looks like raw sewage. The guru or the respected teacher at the temple on the ghats tells me phlegmatically that he takes a dip in the river twice a day. He says, there's a difference between the eye and the mind. The eye sees only the surface, the mind perceives true meaning. The annual rhythms of the Yamuna harmonize with the ebb and flow of farmers and laborers, the Hindu ritual calendar, and charitable and funerary practices, and the desire of some city dwellers for an open space. The banks also provided a space where washermen from the walled city could spread laundered clothes to dry in the sun. The riverbank functioned as an urban commons with unwritten but nonetheless tangible norms about access and use, with areas being informally demarcated by function. Among these public functions, defecation ranks high. For large sections of the urban poor who live on or close to the riverbed and who don't have access to sanitation, the wilderness of the riverbed is a vast open-air toilet where the occasional shrubs and rocky outcrops provide privacy. Early morning and late evening, under cover of dark, groups of women with veiled faces pick their way through little piles of waste to the more remote spots. Later in the day, men repair to the wasteland armed with plastic bottles of water to wash themselves after they're done. To those who live there, these widely practiced, agreed upon uses are by no means an infringement of the commons, though that is how they're perceived by well-to-do citizens who have access to toilets in their homes. Like rural commons, pastures, forests, and streams, the riverbed too is a resource on which the poor depend more than those who own private lands. Unlike the rural commons, the poor do not gather fuel, fodder, or berries here. Instead, their chief usufruct is space for the conduct of a basic biological function, a space that is notably scarce in the city. However, defecation contributes to the sense of the riverbed as a literal wasteland, derelict and defiled. It evokes disgust, intersecting with a wider popular perception of the place as an abused, uncared for non-place. The association in the popular imagination of the riverbed with poor people and their polluting practices was to play an important part in destroying perhaps the most vibrant and biggest cultural worlds on the riverfront. Ironically, this once flourishing community was in some ways also a product of the wider popular perception of the floodplain as a non-place. I'm talking about the settlement of the poor on the riverfront in the 1980s and 1990s and their subsequent eviction in the 2000s, which were both processes that derived from the marginality of this space. Their opposing tendencies indicate a historic shift in popular perceptions of how a non-place should be treated. The subsequent phase of reclamation of the riverbed in the 2000s inaugurates the current moment of creating value via commodification, incorporating a non-place into the spaces of capitalist consumption. In the late 1970s, there was a spurt of building in the capital to construct facilities for the Asian Games, which were to be held in Delhi in 1982. This project was one where national prestige was supposed to be at stake, and this provided the grounds for the Delhi government to violate its own master plan and suspend rules in order to enter into shady contracts with construction firms. Flyovers, sports facilities, and luxury apartments were built, apartments to house participating athletes, which were later sold as homes to senior bureaucrats. All of this construction activity brought to the city an estimated 1 million laborers from other states. Once the construction was over, these laborers stayed on, often in shanty settlements in the shadow of the concrete structures they'd built, seeking other employment. In the 1980s, their presence was tolerated and even encouraged by local politicians who got them water taps and ration cards to give them subsidized food. The populist governments at the center were willing to allow the migrants some recognition, although of a limited nature. While government concern didn't extend to giving them low-cost housing or legal rights over the land that they occupied, or any other civic amenities, it did give workers a temporary reprieve in the battle to create homes around their places of work. Thousands of workers who were involved in the construction of buildings for the Asian Games in '82 along the river's western embankment came to settle in the surrounding areas. In later years, more followed, so that by 2004, almost 350,000 poor squatters lived along the Yamuna banks in Delhi. There were a few farmers among them, but the majority were workers, small vendors, porters, rickshaw pullers, masons, mechanics, artisans, factory workers, domestic help, security guards, who built homes in the only centrally located place that afforded them a space close to their means of livelihood. Over the course of more than 20 years, they populated the land along the embankments, strengthened their shanty houses with brick, cement, and even concrete, secured public water taps and electricity, started schools and health clinics with the help of NGOs and the state government. Concealed from public view, this low-lying land of the Yamuna embankment became transformed into a dense settlement of Delhi's underclass, a squalid, illegal, but nonetheless vibrant cultural world. In 2004, defecation along the Yamuna by these settlers became the grounds for the demolition of their homes. The Delhi High Court ordered that the Yamuna settlements be removed because they were responsible for polluting the river and because they were encroaching on the riverbed. Both these charges were based on a selective use of facts. The Yamuna River is polluted, but by the unchecked discharge of domestic sewage. It receives about 1,800 million liters of untreated wastewater every day as it passes through the city. Delhi as a whole produces about 3,000 MLD of sewage, which is more sewage than all the class 2 cities in India put together, but more than half of all sewage goes untreated. And notably, this wastewater is generated by only half of Delhi's 14 million population. Those who lived in what are called planned colonies, regularized colonies, resettlement colonies, and urban villages. The other 7 million who live in illegal and unauthorized colonies, like those on the Yamuna embankment, do not have access to drains and sewage and sewerage. So by ordering the eviction of embankment dwellers and the eviction of squatters on the grounds that they were polluting the river, the judiciary placed the burden of excrement produced by Delhi's well-to-do citizens on the working class people of these settlements along the river. A similar shifting of blame was evident in the charge of encroachment. While it's indeed true that the embankment settlers were squatting on land that was legally owned by the government, far larger tracts over this land along the river had been taken over by the government and handed over to private bodies in violation of the master plan for Delhi, which designated these lands as an ecological zone. So there were 2 power plants, disused sports facilities built for the 1982 Asian Games along the Yamuna waterfront. There was also then a giant information technology park, a sprawling metro train depot, and a giant Akshardham temple complex, which was retrospectively legalized by the Supreme Court over the protests of the land owning agency. Also on the drawing board was the Commonwealth, in 2010 was the Commonwealth Games Village with high-rise luxury apartments. A shopping mall, housing for Delhi metro workers, a bus depot were also waiting to be built. However, none of these projects was criticized for being located on the riverbed in direct contravention of the area's land use designation as an ecological zone. In fact, the court permitted all of them to go ahead. Only the settlements of poor workers were targeted for demolition. The consequences of this 2004 court order were devastating. Sanjay Amar Colony was one of a series of working class settlements along the Yamuna embankment on the western side of the river. The settlement was a no fly-by-night agglomeration of ramshackle huts. Over the course of more than 20 years, hundreds of brick and cement dwellings came to line the streets. Of the population of this colony of about 350,000 people, an estimated 150,000 were displaced over the course of 1 week in June, with the rest to follow. When the bulldozers left, the pushtar resembled a bombed-out site. Hundreds of homeless families camped out under the ferocious summer sun, wondering where to go, warily avoiding the police posted in the area to preempt any protest. Hundreds of people sifted through the rubble, trying to salvage their belongings. The Yamuna Pushkar demolitions were part of a citywide campaign to clear squatter settlements that between 2000 and 2004 displaced an estimated 800,000 people from the capital. In theory, the Delhi government had a policy of offering land compensation to those who could offer proof of residence. However, resettlement colonies were little more than wastelands with no amenities, 20 to 30 kilometers from people's place of work. Yet, despite the difficulties of relocating to such inhospitable places, losing jobs, withdrawing children from school, people still grabbed at the chance to secure a legitimate home in the city. But only 16% of those displaced from the Yamuna embankment were eligible to get plots. The rest were simply rendered homeless. Some scattered to the city's periphery, living on rent in squatter settlements on the margins of Delhi state, forced to again live precariously in the interstices of the law and the urban economy. The shift in popular perceptions and political equations from tolerating and even encouraging settlement in the 1980s and early 1990s to the brute removal of squatters in the 2000s was reflective of a new hardening of attitudes towards the city's working class and antipathy towards informal livelihoods and spaces on the part of an urban elite that had become disproportionately empowered in the liberalization policies adopted in the 1990s and that had the backing of the higher courts. This bourgeois environmentalism ignored the structural compulsions behind squatting on public lands by poor people to adopt a more hardline position against slum dwellers. A High Court judge remarked that settling an encroacher on public land in a place that was given by the government was akin to rewarding a pickpocket. The economics of everyday life in the city of surviving when wages are low dictate that people live close to their workplace. But this need goes unmet in Delhi's real estate market that offers little legal housing for poor workers. During 1994 to 2004, the Delhi Development Authority planned to build 1.62 million dwelling units, but it built only 500,000, none of them within the economic reach of the poor. It's no surprise then that more than 23% of Delhi's population lives in squatter settlements like those along the Yamuna. Encroachment was not a choice but a compulsion for poor workers, their hope of securing a foothold in the urban economy. However, in the court's determination to clean the river by clearing its banks of poor squatters, the underlying political economy of housing in the city was ignored, as was the complicity of the state in enabling settlement on the riverfront in the first place. The court's selective targeting of poor squatters while letting more powerful polluters and encroachers off the hook reflects a partial and even distorted environmental vision of Delhi's well-to-do citizens. A feature of bourgeois environmentalism is its hostility to the poor in the pursuit of a clean and green environment, where the very presence of the poor is equated with pollution. Cleaning the Yamuna didn't thus take the form of installing sewage treatment facilities, but entailed the removal of working class squatters from the riverbank. An aesthetic vision has been central to this quest of making Delhi a world-class city. According to this aesthetic mode of governing widespread in Delhi today, if a development project looks world-class, then it is most often declared planned. If a settlement looks polluting, it's sanctioned as unplanned and illegal. This helps explain the differential treatment accorded to slums on the one hand and to luxury high-rises and stadiums on the other. Though the eviction of squatters cleared the riverbed, it did nothing to actually address the acute problem of water pollution. Meanwhile, projects that reflected the world-class aspirations of the city's elite were retrospectively legalized. The 2004 demolitions on the west bank of the river were followed by equally harsh evictions from the east bank in the summer of 2006, when more than 50,000 squatters' homes were razed to the ground. By the end of 2006, the riverbank had been cleared of all those citizens whom the court deemed to be non-people, those who failed to legally own private property and whose consequent dependence on the commons rendered them invisible as rights-bearing citizens. Denied access to housing and basic services by the government and then condemned for this very lack, the eviction of working-class settlers and the destruction of their community reflected the consolidation of anti-poor hostility on the part of the judiciary, bourgeois environmentalists and state officials. In retrospect, it became evident that the hostile maneuvers of demolition and displacement were a necessary precondition for the transformation of the riverfront as a place of value. The removal of non-people was essential for the reinvention of a non-place. By 2007, selectively cleared of its encroachments, the Yamuna riverfront appeared to be terra nullius, an uninhabited place outside the realm of value, inviting investment. If the High Court order evicting poor squatters seemed to indicate some concern for the polluted state of the river, no such environmental concern was evident when it came to permitting the construction of capital intensive projects on the riverbed. In July 2009, a bench of the Supreme Court, headed by the Chief Justice, approved the construction of luxury high rise apartments close to the river as part of a complex to house athletes and officials during the Commonwealth Games held in 2010. The 2010 Games Village had been the center of controversy since its inception, with an environmentalist NGO, Keep Yamuna Alive, Yamuna Ji Abhiyan, petitioning the court to stop construction since permanent structures on the riverbed would adversely affect its ecological functioning as an area crucial for groundwater recharge and accommodating intense flows during the monsoons. The construction was also challenged by a farmers' cooperative from nearby villages who protested against the takeover of their land, first for the Akshardham temple and then the Games Village. The farmers said, the government's been talking about creating biodiversity parks, but we've been maintaining biodiversity here for almost 60 years. Just let us be. However, the judges didn't find any merit in the environmental arguments of the Save the River campaign or the farmers and ruled to allow construction. Most significantly, they didn't justify their decision on grounds that the urgency or importance of the Commonwealth Games projects superseded environmental concerns. Unlike, say, the airport project we visited yesterday, where strategic concerns were sort of trumped the environmental or other arguments. The Delhi judgment stated categorically that all the arguments about the ecological value of the location were baseless. They said this place was not a riverbed or a floodplain. Now, once the Supreme Court said that, this was a green signal for converting the riverfront to real estate, and this has sealed the fate of the river Yamuna. No longer a non-place, it's become a frontier for get-rich-quick schemes, for speculation in a land market that has seen spiraling prices in the booming post-liberalized urban economy. Along with speculation have come sweetheart deals, with state officials colluding with private developers to profit from the transfer of public lands. Among similar subsidies given out to private developers, the case of Akshardham temple stands out. Built on 90 acres in the floodplain, the sprawling site includes a lake, extensive gardens with a musical fountain, an IMAX theatre, a food court, and a center for applied research in social harmony. Commentators have characterized the complex as a religious theme park, a form of Disney divinity. Construction of the temple began illegally in 2000, despite protests from farmers who were evicted for the land. However, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the temple, pointing out that most of it had already been built, an argument that was likely to have been influenced by the power of the religious organization building it. Projects such as the Akshardham temple and the Commonwealth Games Village illustrate how the new development has been actively fostered by the government, with massive subsidies being given to corporate organizations, not only through land being transferred at nominal rates, but also through interest-free loans and buyback guarantees. Other capital-intensive projects have rapidly flowed in its wake. The Delhi Metro Rail Corporation has located its Yamuna Bank station within 300 meters of the river. Parsanath builders have constructed a shopping mall adjacent to the Games Village, and the remaining land along the river is earmarked for similar projects. The reinvention of the riverfront is proceeding apace. As one travels along the overhead metro line from central to East Delhi, crossing the Yamuna on the new metro bridge, one can look down on the patchwork of farms rapidly being replaced by grand buildings. In most citizens' eyes, the transformation is a welcome one. Finally, the neglected suburb of East Delhi, home to slums and middle-class neighborhoods, has a skyline to be proud of. And if this skyline swallows up the non-place that was a river, that is just as it should be, for in its place is now a landscape of value, where the worth of a place can be measured in money and in the recognizable form of architectural excess. What then remains of the Yamuna as an ecological entity that lies outside the circuit of commodity value? Has the imagination of urban Delhi been completely colonized by the vision of the riverfront as a world-class space? Has the river been comprehensively transformed into real estate? The line between water and land not only changes with the seasons, becoming especially blurred during the 3 monsoon months when the river swells to accommodate 70% of its annual flow. But it has also altered over the years as successive embankments have gradually hemmed in the river and reclaimed land from its bed. Until the 1970s, the floodplain was regarded as a wasteland, given over to seasonal cultivation by farmers' co-ops who leased land from the Flood and Irrigation Department. The very fact of land ownership by that agency indicates that the primary purpose of this strip was related to the management of water in the city. Small-scale farming on the rich silt deposited by the river was not seen as contradictory to the flow of regulating water, to the task of regulating water flows. The incremental construction of embankments in a piecemeal fashion to protect settlements along the river from occasional flooding eventually created a network of parallel lines that effectively restricted the river's channel and allowed accelerated build-up on the banks. The big spurt of construction along the river's west bank before the Asian Games in '82 was accompanied by the spread of squatter settlements housing the city's working class that, with the encouragement of the government, kept expanding over the next 2 decades. The subsequent eviction on the charge of pollution cleared the way for the construction of capital-intensive projects of urban infrastructure and elite consumption. These projects gave material shape to what the then Chief Minister Sheila Dikshit mentioned as her vision of riverfront development that mimics other world-class cities. Sheila Dikshit frequently mooted the idea of channelizing the river in the manner resembling the Thames in London or the Seine in Paris, with the river fitting into the cityscape as a site of leisure and recreation, with cultural performances and other modes of public consumption. This seemingly benign project of creating the riverfront as a public space, one that may forge a relationship between the river and the residents of Delhi, hides key issues, both social and ecological. One, the space will not really be open to the public, for the direction of its redistribution already shows that it favors corporate capital and private and elite public modes of consumption. Not only will these new spaces exclude most residents of the city, but in fact they've already done so, because the land made available for the new developments has been taken from farmers and by evicting hundreds of thousands of poor slum dwellers who previously occupied this land. It must also be borne in mind that the Yamuna is not the Thames or the Seine. Its distinctive rhythms are harmonized to the Indian subcontinent's seasons. With the bulk of its flow concentrated in the monsoons, the Yamuna is liable to breach its embankments if deprived of its present fertile expanse. While the floods in Mumbai and New Orleans are recent examples of the hazards of building in a river's floodplain, the residents of North Delhi and the Yamuna embankment have also experienced the risk of a swiftly rising river. The vast stretches of riverbed revealed in the summer months may lure developers, but the line between land and water is swiftly dissolved once the rains come. As Mike Davis reminds us, nature is not a stable backdrop against which humans can orchestrate their affairs. That natural processes have their own dynamism and integrity must be borne in mind, lest world-class ambitions flounder on the fluvial bed of the Yamuna. The spatial and temporal flow of the Yamuna through Delhi shows the fluctuating fortunes of urban ecology as a concern in the cultural politics of the city. In 2009, the ecological value of the floodplain was comprehensively dismissed by the Supreme Court's declaration that the area along the river was neither a riverbed nor a floodplain and could be incorporated into a regime of commodity value as real estate. However, the floods of 2010 challenged that assertion, reminding the city of the presence of a river in their midst, an ecological entity that could not be fully controlled and that demanded its natural due. In this talk, I've tried to show the contestations over the Yamuna as not merely another inevitable instance of the enclosure of the commons, a historical accompaniment to the onward march of capitalism, or of accumulation by dispossession within an age of new imperialism. Though they fit within this wider pattern of accumulation going on in contemporary India, the processes that have rendered the riverfront a place of commodified value are also anchored in a longer standing set of aesthetic values associated with modernity. These values made the riverfront a non-place inhabited by non-people, illegible as either nature or culture. Among the many intersecting ways of making nature recognizable as a place of value, spectacular scenery, charismatic megafauna, religious significance, or national prestige. Commodification is only one. It is a conjuncture with the period of liberalization that has enabled the emergence of commodity aesthetics as a dominant form of imparting value to the river, allowing the Yamuna to be seen and imagined as a desirable place, but as not just as a place, but as a commodified place. However, the floods assert a contrary doctrine, reiterating the force of ecological limits and emphasizing that the floodplain of the Yamuna continues to be a place that defies commodification and thus defines the limits of capitalism. I'd like to end with a quote, one that's probably familiar to you. But land, labor, and money are obviously not commodities. They're not produced for sale. Labor is only another name for a human activity which goes with life itself. And nor can that activity be detached from the rest of life. Land is only another name for nature which is not produced by man. The commodity description of labor, land, and money is entirely fictitious. But nonetheless, the commodity fiction supplies a vital organizing principle in regard to the whole of society. Those of you who will recognize these words know they're from Karl Polanyi's 1944 classic, The Great Transformation, a book that describes one of the greatest battles of our times, the struggle between economy and society. Polanyi argued that in the 19th and 20th centuries, and also we can say in the 21st, whenever the economy, by which he meant markets, especially capitalist ones, whenever the economy gained supremacy over other aspects of life, there was a counter-response, a response rooted in other dimensions of cultural being that sought to contain the annihilating power of commodity fictions. These counter-movements could take different forms. They could be millenarian, fascist, socialist, populist, nationalist, but they shared a common belief that nature and humanity were not commodities, and that organizing production around the commodity fictions of land and labor would annihilate something of their essence. So I would like to use that as a point on which to close my presentation, because I think that what is going on in Delhi, the commodification of land around the river Yamuna, shows us some of the contradictory forces at work in trying to challenge the idea of nature as commodity. Because bourgeois environmentalism stands against the rights of small farmers, stands against the rights of squatter settlers. Large capitalist projects make a common cause with the government. And so there are all sorts of forces at work at this present conjuncture. And I want to stress their dynamism, that this moment is something that is being struggled over and may well may well yet pass if we go on trying to build progressive alliances. Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I enjoyed it very much. It reminded me of a paper that I read, also similar. It was called Deep Democracy, and a lot of the discussion was about defecation. And I was trying to, it's something that you don't usually read about, no? And I was wondering, ironically, should we perhaps invent some sort of association or project or even trade union for the right to shit? I mean, let's put it this way. Do we need to demand the right to shit? It's outrageous, no? It takes us back to the discussion that we had a little bit earlier on about this thing that I have an obsession with, no? The invisible subject. And I didn't use it because I like this concept, but it was written in the program, by the way, and was related to the equality and justice issue, no? So, and I like the fact that you ended up with Polanyi, because when we think of the fictitious commodities that we are using this concept a lot in ENTITLE, and it's a great concept. But how about, I'm trying to push here, and precisely to push our our desire to be humanistic, no? If we say that actually what is fictitious is not just labor, land, and money, but what is fictitious is also worker, I don't know, salary, material, material wealth, I don't know. So it's not just that kind of work or that kind of money or land. It's a matrix of power, no? Why do we need to not think about this in terms of fictions, productions? Again, it's a production, no? So what is fiction? It's a social production that is convenient more than this, no? As you showed perfectly in your presentation. So it's a production, it's a fiction, it's a narrative that was convenient since not only modern colonial times, but if you want ancient Greek, no? When we were thinking about the roots of democracy, and when democracy was conceived as only for some, only some were, how do they call it? Zone politikon, no? The rest were the animals. So even democracy is conceived, has at the roots the production of animals, not humans. So for me, it's very important to, I want to hear if you think that it's too much to actually talk about the fictitious object of the worker or identity of the worker, if you want. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll take 2, 3. Maybe more time to think. Yeah.
Can you give some information about the structure of the construction industry, which really does this new constructions in New Delhi? I mean, and also its relationships with the authorities, the state or the city authority. Yeah, more specific, like what are the mechanisms that within what mechanisms this land, this urban land or the land which is at the outskirts of this land is allocated to constructors, and do these constructors have some specific relationships with the authorities, elected or appointed authorities? Okay.
Thanks. It's a really wonderful paper, really beautifully written as well. So really enjoyed it very much. Although this story is obviously a tragedy. I was curious to push you on the question of why you're describing it not as new imperialism or accumulation by dispossession, but rather going with the Polanyi route or Mike Davis's dynamism of nature, because it does seem to me that it's a description of nature as accumulation strategy, and it seems to me that there's a lot in the description of the afterlife of empire, and the significance. I wonder if you could comment on the afterlife of empire and the significance of the post-colonial nation, and I'm thinking in particular of, you know, these themes of the temple, how it relates to Hindu nationalism. The Commonwealth Games obviously has to do with the British Empire, and having been modeled, the riverbank being modeled on the Thames, for example. It seems to me that there's actually quite a narrative of imperialism, not even necessarily in a new sense. So why distance the argument from you know, David Harvey, et cetera, you know? But thank you, it was a really beautiful paper.
Tough questions, so let me try and answer them. First of all, one, I think, yeah, you pinpointed what is a major concern of mine, which is that we don't talk about things like shit, and we certainly don't talk about the fact that all shit is not equal. And I'm very interested in sort of underground systems in cities, especially sewage systems. And the fact that most of the people in Delhi don't have access to sewage systems means that they can't flush and forget about it. So who has the power to flush and do away with, and the tremendous wastage of water that's involved in using flush toilets and so on. So I think there's a whole political ecology around sewage and water that we need to highlight, and there are people who are beginning to do that. I mean, I think of the work of say Nikhil Anand, who did his PhD at Stanford and who looked at sewage systems in Bombay, and he has a whole thesis about infra-politics that is very useful. Incidentally, the Indian government now has a big campaign about sanitation in urban and rural areas. But the politics, I mean, I won't have time to go into that, we can talk about it later, but the politics of it are deeply problematic. A lot of it is built around the idea of patriarchal honor, that, if you're a decent man, you should not let the women of your family go out to shit. It's true that for women it's a huge inconvenience not to not have a toilet at home, but surely the first reason of it can't be that you have to prevent her movement outside the home. But be that as it may, this question of what is fictitious and how can we problematize the idea of fictions beyond land, labor and money is, I think, crucially important, because the minute one starts to think about everything as socially constructed, then I think our attention gets drawn much more to how certain things are naturalized. And what Polanyi is directing our attention to is the way in which labor and land, I mean, he doesn't spend that much time talking about money, but labor and land are naturalized as commodities, as things which are off the market. And he's showing us that he's telling us they're not. But if one were to do the same thing across the board, then I think it would help us to see how people we think of in categories, as categories like workers, are in fact, don't necessarily need to be in that category. They could also be women, they could be Turks, they could be Indians, etc. Which is why I think, coming back to the morning's discussion about, which workers do you make alliances with? Is it always going to be industrial workers, or can we think about workers as in a new way, as farmers who are fighting to save their land from mining? Those are workers too. So maybe we need to then think just critically about all the categories that we use, the exclusions that they perform when we choose certain categories rather than others, be it exclusions around gender or race or class or caste, and then what kinds of alliances they help legitimize and what are the ones that they exclude. So I think these are difficult questions that only come out in certain contexts. I mean, I provided one context, but they will be differently, they'll emerge differently in different places. The question of the legacy of colonialism is very much at work here. And I wouldn't say it's just, in a way, British colonialism necessarily, but I think certain imperial ideas that circulate around the world. And I think a modernist aesthetic is certainly one that exceeds British claims to it. I mean, modernism as a movement would, from Germany, from all of Europe, one can see it in Brasilia, one can see it in New Delhi, one can see it in a number of, purpose-built capitals. Yeah, I mean, spectacular events such as the Commonwealth Games, before that the Asian Games, also participate in a certain kind of internationalist logic, which I think is the Commonwealth is the legacy of colonialism. But I think there's more to these sorts of international networks than colonialism or a new imperialism. And certainly, as far as the Indian modern aesthetic of the world-class city goes, even as it derives from London, and people always mention London and Paris, they also mention Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. And Singapore is the way in which I think upper middle class Indians would love to live if they had the chances. It's air-conditioned around the clock, it's heavily policed. So there are parts of Singapore that it's always clean, and you can get fined on the streets for spitting. So So there's certain kind of, discipline in Singapore that the bourgeois environmentalists that I talk about absolutely adore. What they don't pay that much attention to, of course, is the way in which Singapore insists on affordable housing that's socially diverse, or that insists on public transport, and you pay a hefty registration fee if you want to own a private vehicle. That part gets written out of the picture because bourgeois environmentalists in India think it's their, sort of birthright to be able to own a private vehicle. So there's certain aspects of what they think of as world class that get picked up, and this is a kind of pastiche that gets fitted into a particular social and economic, very unequal context here. So I agree, it's colonial, it's imperial, but I think it exceeds those bounds. And by pointing to those longer historical continuities and more geographical dispersion, I want to sort of get away from the sort of one story that this is capitalism, marching in these big boots around the world, because I think context matters. And so, here religious beliefs matter, nationalism matters, and, I think in each place these create very distinctive patterns. Your question, Ali, about Delhi and the way in which land is developed. Most of land in Delhi was acquired for quote-unquote development by a state authority from the 1950s onwards. They mainly bought land at low prices from farmers in the areas around Delhi. They didn't use much of that land for a long time. So the farmers then decided to sell the land privately to small builders. So a large proportion of Delhi's population, something like 40%, lives in what are called unauthorized colonies. It's a kind of legal gray area because these are reasonably, well-built housing estates, but the land has, in theory, been acquired by the government, so that's technically illegal. And there's been a long battle to try and get these regularized. Apart from that, there's land that the government owns itself directly, mainly the Delhi Development Authority, the railways, and that's the land on which these squatter settlements have come up. And these are supposed to be completely illegal, so therefore they can be demolished and the people who live in them evicted. Delhi has an Urban Land Ceiling Act, so private developers can't build huge, big sprawling gated communities, etc. These have come up on the periphery of Delhi, because private developers have been allowed to buy land directly from farmers, pool it, create big estates. And that's where the really big money is being made, on the outskirts of the original city of Delhi, in places like Gurgaon and so on. So what we see is different forms of capital accumulation within the city and outside. Within the city is a little bit more controlled. Outside is much more sort of, letting private developers have their say. And construction is among the top 3 building parts of the economy, the sectors of the economy, as far as India's economic growth is concerned. And this is, if you drive outside Delhi, what you will see for miles on end are brick kilns where fertile topsoil is being converted into bricks for the construction boom that's going on. And of course, there's a huge number of workers who work in abysmal conditions working on these construction sites. Any more questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I think you closed your talk by saying that there's still some space for some progressive solutions to take place. I wonder what sort of political processes you think could help to bring about those solutions, or political alliances, etc.
Yeah. In the specific, are there more questions? Should I? No? Okay.
Some more, or
If there are any,
there are. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ibrahim from Manchester University. I greatly would like to make some comments on the label land and money, the fictitious commodities. I'm afraid I don't agree when you say it is the labor. I think it is labor power that is fundamentally makes the difference. And about the fictitious commodity,
I'm sorry, can you just expand on that? I didn't understand.
when you say the labor is the commodity, actually it is not the labor, it is a labor power which is a fictitious commodity. Because when I am, let's say the worker is selling the commodity, it is the fictitious commodity of the labor power. It's not the labor, because it's two different things, which makes quite a lot difference in theoretical framework. So that should be put into consideration. Along with the Polanyi, I agree with the first friend, when she was talking, as you said, the commodity form is socially constructed. Therefore, alternative to commodity form, as bourgeois environmentalists can transfer the nature into commodity form, then what we should do to suggest kind of alternative to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Amita, for this presentation. I want to just try to get more of your thoughts on the point of Mark Augier's work on non-lieu, non-places, and the whole circulation that's being facilitated with these non-places. I think there is another aspect to it, which is an issue that we touched very slightly this morning as well, like the circulation of people, no? So those people who are uprooted from their settlements after the construction of these mega projects and so on end up returning. So they basically circulate and come back as service sector workers, as cleaners or whatever, at the end of the day being proletarians. So how do you relate to that, like the circulation and non-places actually creating and contributing towards this, these processes of uprooting people, but then bringing them in the system with a different role? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this question of what sort of hope can we see in this situation? Actually, in this particular case, it was the floods that helped change things, because of that strange conjuncture where the floods were widely televised, everybody came to know about the floods. Not only did it constitute the floods as a news event, it constituted a public around the floods, including those who were not directly affected by it, which I think provided the context in which arguments that were made later in the courts to say that this area needs to be protected as a floodplain carried much greater weight. So the court, which had earlier said this is not a floodplain, this is not a river, you can build on it, now has been giving much more careful orders, asking for certain projects which had been built on the river to actually be dismantled. So big bus depot that was constructed has been asked to be moved out and so on. And I think it was the way in which the floods became, sort of affected people's public consciousness, that the courts also have become much more aware of the ecological importance of protecting the floodplain. This couldn't have happened without the work of the NGO I mentioned, Yamuna Ji Abhiyan, which has been working to build alliances with certain groups of people who were evicted, such as the farmers who had a cooperative lease to the area, but also with people upstream and downstream of Delhi, arguing that you can't think of a river just in terms of its stretch through the city. You have to think of people who are using the water upstream, who might also be polluting the river because of agricultural chemicals or industrial waste. You have to think of what Delhi is doing to the water that is reached by people living downstream. So they've tried to build alliances across the board with different kinds of users of the river, people living along the banks and so on. It's slow work. It's right now not, gotten to a point where people can together say we form a parliament of the river, as for instance has been done in Europe, but at least the idea is there that we think about the river as an ecological entity and you think of different people and their competing uses. the one thing that I think has made its way into the public debate is the idea of minimum ecological flows, which was earlier just not there at all. Now there is a recognition, not just for the Yamuna but for other rivers, that you have to have some way of being able to say that this much water needs to flow in the river through the years, through the seasons, all through the year. You can't abstract all of it out for drinking water or for irrigation or, for something else. So I think slowly there is some sort of changing awareness about the river and the politics around it. There are certain uncomfortable elements to it. This that a progressive alliance is uneasy about. For instance, the NGO that is out to protect the Yamuna, they very often directly appeal to the importance of the Yamuna as in Hindu mythology. Because they say, well, the majority of ordinary people relate to the river as a sacred entity, and if you can remind them of the sacredness of the river, then perhaps they'll stop polluting it and deal with it more respectfully. But this is also an argument that directly leaves out, Muslims, and as a oppressed minority within India, that's something that you have to be very, very careful about. So there are those sorts of debates. What arguments do you use? Arguments which might appeal to the sentiments or sensibilities of one set of people might end up disenfranchising another, and so on. And I think those are things that the movement has to try and figure out along the way. On the question of labor power, laborers, I'm quoting Polanyi, and I don't think he goes into it in details in the way that, say, Marx does in Capital. So rather than enter into it, I'll leave it at that. Your second point about bourgeois environmentalists, I think it's important to, I would really like to distinguish bourgeois environmentalists from other kinds of environmentalists. I mean, I don't want to say that all urban environmentalists in India are bourgeois environmentalists, or that all people who are who come from a bourgeois background are bourgeois environmentalists. There are many people who come from bourgeois background who are working, for the rights of poor people and supporting squatter settlers and trying to find environmentally sensitive ways of being able to make sure that their rights also get protected and promoted and so on. The trouble with bourgeois environmentalism is that it sometimes seems to sit at odds with the way in which the river is being commodified into real estate. But at other times, often the ways in which it chooses to come up with alternative ways of protecting the river as an ecological entity, for instance saying that this is a wetland and should be maintained as such, is insensitive to the fact that the creation of a protected area as a wetland is going to displace hundreds of thousands of poor people. So this is a conflict that has come out, that has come into the open in Delhi, that's come out into the open in Delhi around the issue of air pollution, where something like 100,000 small manufacturing units were shut down because they were blamed for polluting the air in Delhi. And this is something that was done again by an environmentalist, activist, lawyer, even though there were the evidence actually showed that the bulk of air pollution in Delhi is caused by emissions from private vehicles. Nothing was done about the private vehicles, but the factories were shut down and workers were thrown out of their jobs. And workers demands that there be alternative ways of trying to install pollution treatment plants, devices which would control air pollution from the units, etc., were just not listened to. Mainly because a lot of the factory owners wanted to sell the factories and use the land that was then freed up in order to build something else which had greater commercial value. In other cases because they wanted to relocate somewhere else. But workers often came up with middle of the road arguments which would try and prevent pollution while allowing jobs to be held on to. But nobody was really interested in that. Certainly the environmentalists weren't. So it became a standoff between labor organizers and environmentalists. So that's why I'm very critical of bourgeois environmentalists in this case, recognizing that while they might prevent certain forms of commodification here, they aren't doing so in a manner which actually fights the larger injustices that exist within capitalism or outside. On this, issue of Marc Auger and the proletarians, that's a good point. I mean, I need to think much more about it. It's true that the kinds of displacements that have happened have meant that people are living on the periphery of the city. They come in, they travel 3 hours one way in order to, be security guards and, small service workers in the very places where they had once lived and worked. And this is the kind of process of, one could call it, cumulative dispossession that's going on. Instead of accumulation by dispossession, one could call it, cumulative dispossession maybe. That's going on in this case. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I would like to raise 2 points. One related to bourgeois environmentalism. If you are using the category to, let's say, to dismiss always the intervention and the alliances with this kind of group that emerge in some struggle. So, for example, I was thinking again about the struggle in Delhi against incinerator, and there you have, of course, waste pickers, but also different kind of environmental, let's say, concerned people, organization, unionists, but also some argumentation from, let's say, bourgeois environmentalists. So, should we dismiss always, or we should try to engage with them in the struggle to understand their motivation and to articulate their motivation according different, let's say, frame in order to be also reinforced by their support in some way. So this is one point. So I think this is the point. No, it's useful, I think, the category, but still, how we rearticulated this category in a way that could be useful for a certain kind of struggle, generally. Well, then the second one is related to the beliefs and the answer that you give to the, let's say, the comment about accumulation by dispossession. The point is that, of course, inside different kind of society, emerge different kind of common senses that are played out, okay? And beliefs and value according to the anthropology, the religions, beliefs, and so on and so forth. But the point is how these different common sense of beliefs and values are really able to engage with the main driver that is played out by capitalist process. So, I mean, we cannot just say, you know, there is a difference is there over there, and this, of course, have a role. We should be more clear on what is this role is playing out in the struggle. Because sometimes what happens is that the hegemonic discourses and imaginary of capitalism, like modern also, that is even wider than capitalism, can use this belief and common senses to still pursue their own interest. So it's important also not just to claim that there is a diversity of belief, but that also in the struggle how these beliefs are played out in different discourses. And if these belief and value are able to be counter-hegemonic to the main driver of modernization and capitalization. So I think this is also very important to me. Okay.
Right, okay. This needs lots more thought than 30 seconds. But the question about bourgeois environmentalism, I mean, I've been very interested in it in my own work because I actually came to study environmental politics in Delhi after looking at struggles against a large dam in central India. So mainly struggles around access to land, forests, water, and so on, which was the sort of quintessential movement that could be described as an environmentalism of the poor. And long ago, Ram Guha, who was one of the major sort of theoreticians of the Indian environmental movement, he said that Indian environmentalism is different from the kind you find in North America and Europe, and in Europe, because it's an environmentalism of poor people. It's not a kind of post-industrial, we want nature as a beautiful place for recreation or, for a spiritual rejuvenation, etc. So having first, studied environmentalism of a social movement that was really a sort of classic case of an environmentalism of the poor, when I started working on Delhi, I was first struck by the fact that there was no major resistance by poor people to circumstances and processes that were directly affecting their ability to survive in the city. Yet what I saw was an elite form of environmentalism that was very powerful. It operated through the courts, it used the media very successfully, and that consciously used power in order to do what it saw was good for the environment. And as somebody who would like to think of herself as an environmentalist, I found this deeply sort of discomforting, that there is this kind of politics which is completely blind, not just blind, but actually hostile to questions about social justice. And one can see this in rural areas too, where there's been a movement to protect areas which harbor, good forests or big charismatic megafauna, etc. And the idea is to create these protected enclaves, which involves shifting local people out because they're seen as destroyers of forests. And that kind of wildlife conservation is also a form of bourgeois environmentalism, I think. So I think it's important to recognize the way in which environmentalism can't simply be divided up into, here's the global north, here's the global south, and this is what their politics necessarily are going to be. One has to look at these forms in their very contradictory, the forms that they take. Having said that, I think the question that you asked about, well, what do we actually do with this? Do we just label them as a bad category and put them aside? Or do we then try and engage constructively with them? I mean, that's a crucial question. In the case of Delhi, I found that certain people, after you call them bourgeois environmentalists and make them, argue with them about what they're saying, they are willing to engage and think more about what they're doing. Sometimes also one may find that tactically you have to ally with them because they're the ones who are making the most headway in certain circumstances. So to give an example, on the southwest border of Delhi, there's a beautiful forest which has been a sacred grove and has been protected for hundreds of years, that is now under threat from real estate developers. And most of the villagers have sold their lands to these developers and are no longer in a position to protect the sacred grove, even though many of them have regrets about the fact that they've sold it. The only people who want to protect that sacred grove are those who live in these high-rise condominiums and gated communities nearby, who are sort of, really sort of excited, oh look, it's a sacred grove, and also, happy that there's a piece of the forest that's left, because they're living in a desert of more and more high-rises. And that's the irony there, that these are the people for whom the forest was cleared in order to create these high-rises. These are the people who are busy using up so much water that the ground, the water table is like sunk beyond redemption. And yet they're interested in saving the forest that remains. So it's a kind of, after me, I mean, you drop the drawbridge and then get very environmentalist. But in this case, these are the people who are actually going to save that forest if anybody does. So I think one has to recognize these kinds of contradictions and try and, work with them to the extent that is possible, as well as try and change how people see their own. So, remind them this, yes, you're protecting this forest, but have you thought about, your own lifestyle? Have you thought about the water you use or the other resources that you use up? Finally, this question about capitalism and counter-hegemonic movements. This is really a question, I think, of, sorry, who asked that? I think I'm looking at the Giacomo. You did, right? Yeah. Yeah. I need to think more about it. I think we all need to collectively think more about it. But I think what ideologies are, what sensibilities and sentiments are at work are to a certain extent malleable. There are certain things you can do with them, and you can find, progressive elements within Hinduism, just as you can find deeply regressive ones. One has to deal with a political terrain where certain kinds of ideologies have already been claimed and monopolized by certain people. In Delhi's case, Hindu nationalists have already in a way claimed that religious territory. So often if you end up using that language of saying this is sacred or this should be preserved because we have a cultural relationship to it, you end up playing in the hands of people who also are deeply hostile to other religions or who have an upper caste, male, chauvinistic point of view and so on. So one has to work very carefully to, in some ways, revive the more progressive or the more malleable elements within ideologies, including ideologies of capitalism. The extent to which they make universalistic claims and the extent to which those claims can then be held to make governments accountable or to make corporations accountable. So I also with ideas of nationalism and citizenship. I think all of these are a terrain of struggle where one has to try and use the sort of positive spin that exists in these ideas to one's own ends, while at the same time trying to craft an alternative vocabulary that is in conversation with these.
Okay, I have one question before we close, and I would like you to jump scales a bit in talking about these contradictions of bourgeois environmentalism, and very much related to my own work, where we have this bourgeois environmentalist discourse of green, clean hydropower and how it, is one of the only forms of energy that should be promoted in India, that has to be promoted, and then looking at how the contradictions and how this has really very tremendous impacts in the very places that where these dams are built, but that are so far removed from the urban centers where the energy and also the industrial conglomerates where the energy is consumed. So I also see this as another scale of invisibility. I mean, especially in the areas where I work, I know that in large parts of India, people don't even know who lives there and how many people live there and how many people are affected. So I was wondering if you could give an bourgeois environmentalist perspectives on this contradiction, and also maybe say something about how this bourgeois environmentalism in the urban centers is driving this kind of development in India.
I mean, there really is a sort of schizophrenia about this, in the sense that certain things become visible at certain times and others don't. And I think hydropower and also nuclear, by the way, nuclear is also now big on India's agenda as something that's relatively clean in the carbon emissions sense, and also part of the whole sort of, being a superpower business. So I think both hydropower and nuclear have become, have got a renewed sort of legitimacy because of the climate change debate. You're absolutely right that people who live in Sikkim or Arunachal Pradesh, the places where the dams you're studying are being built, don't exist. I mean, there's a kind of, I think there's a mental map in people's heads, in the heads of bourgeois environmentalists. And why just bourgeois environmentalists? I think a lot of middle class metropolitan Indians, where the map of India can be seen as a kind of a mosaic, that, they're the cities which are sort of real, places where you live. Then there are these badlands which exist around cities, and then there's large parts of the map which have no light at all. They're just in complete darkness, and those are non-places. Globally, I think people have the same point of view. So people think of, large parts of, say, sub-Saharan Africa as a non-place, or within environmentalists, to, there might be certain places that stand out as virtuous places, the Himalayan foothills where the women are hugging trees, or maybe the, I don't know, Bolivian highlands or something. But there is a way in which we tend to, I think of the world as a mosaic, where there's places of high capitalism, places of ecological virtue, places which are literally off the map. And all of these maps, I think, come with certain kinds of mindsets that one has to be able to look at critically. I mean, the Northeast only exists in the minds of upper class Indians to the extent that it is seen as a place of violence. It's a place where the army needs to be in order to prevent insurgency. So the fact that there are real people living there who are the victims of that violence, real people who might be fighting to save their land from dams, is certainly not a part of the common sense discourse or the public as we know it. And that public is actually an elite, and that's the tragedy of Indian democracy, that what's called the public is actually a debate that's monopolized by elites. But you know this. I'm not saying anything new.
Okay, thank you, Amita, for this great talk and all the great work in answering the questions. We'll meet again at 2:30.